stranded on a frozen world. The sky was a swirling mass of deep indigo, a storm raging in the distance, carrying icy winds that howled through the desolate valley. Snow and ice stretched endlessly in all directions, a vast frozen wasteland where nothing but the hardiest creatures survived. It was a world of silence and death, a place that showed no mercy to the weak. Jace Carter had no idea how long he had been stranded here. Time had become meaningless. His ship had crashed during an emergency escape from a pirate ambush, sending him spiraling toward this unknown planet. The moment he emerged from the wreckage, he knew survival would be a battle against not just the environment, but whatever else lurked in the shadows. The cold was relentless. It gnawed at his bones, stiffened his muscles, and stole the breath from his lungs. His survival suit offered some protection, but it was failing. The emergency power was draining, and he had no way of knowing how long he had before hypothermia set in completely. Then came the tracks, deep, clawed footprints in the ice. Something had been here. Something big. His pulse quickened as he followed the trail, not knowing whether he was walking toward salvation or his end. The first sign of life came in the form of firelight flickering in the distance. Jace's instincts screamed at him to be cautious, but desperation overruled caution. He pushed forward, each step a battle against the frozen ground beneath his boots. The moment he entered the clearing, he saw it. A towering figure, armored in thick, biometallic plating, stood beside the fire, its alien form silhouetted against the flames. It was a warrior. Jace had encountered many species in his travels, but this one was unfamiliar, tall, with powerful limbs and eyes that glowed like molten silver. A heavy weapon rested on its back, but its gaze wasn't hostile. It was something worse. Calculating. The warrior took a slow step forward, scanning him with an eerie stillness. Jace braced himself, but the alien merely lifted a hand and gestured toward the fire. An invitation. Jace hesitated. Trusting an unknown alien was reckless. But the alternative, freezing to death alone in the storm, was far worse. He clenched his fists and stepped closer, keeping his guard up. The heat of the fire stung his frozen skin, but he welcomed it. He watched as the warrior crouched beside him, studying him with a gaze that felt too intelligent, too knowing. The creature spoke in a low, guttural voice, its language thick with unfamiliar sounds. Jace shook his head. "I don't understand." The warrior narrowed its eyes before tapping a device on its arm. A moment later, the guttural sounds shifted into something he could comprehend. "Cold kills the weak. You are not weak." Jace exhaled sharply. So, it wasn't just a simple rescue. There was an expectation, an evaluation. He didn't like the way the alien studied him as if weighing his worth. "Who are you?" Jace asked cautiously. The warrior tilted its head slightly, considering him before answering. "I am Zithrak. This is my world now." Jace frowned. "Your world? You live here?" Zithrak's gaze flickered toward the storm beyond the fire. "No one lives here. They survive." Jace didn't need to be told twice. This planet was death incarnate, and if Zithrak was still alive, it meant he had learned to master it. But why help him? Zithrak's eyes lingered on him, then he spoke again. "You are alone. That makes you prey." Jace stiffened. "Not if I can help it." The warrior let out a low, rumbling sound that might have been amusement, or warning. "The night is long," Zithrak said. "The fire will not last. And out there," he gestured to the darkness, "the cold is not your only enemy." Jace swallowed hard. He had been so focused on the freezing temperatures, he hadn't considered what else might be lurking in the dark. Then, Zithrak delivered the ultimatum. "Stay close. Or freeze." The meaning was clear. The fire alone wouldn't be enough. If he wanted to make it through the night, he'd have to stay near the one being who might be just as dangerous as the cold itself. Jace met Zithrak's unblinking gaze, his mind racing. Survive the cold, or stay close. He wasn't sure which was the worse fate. The warrior's terms. The fire crackled between them, a fragile barrier against the frozen world that threatened to consume Jace Carter whole. His body ached, his limbs stiff from exposure, but it was the weight of Zithrak's gaze that unsettled him the most. The alien's silver eyes reflected the flames, unreadable yet piercing, as if stripping away the layers of Jace's being to assess something deeper. Jace wasn't a fool. He knew this wasn't just a simple offer of shelter. There were terms, unspoken, but looming. The cold gnawed at his resolve, forcing him closer to the fire. The warrior didn't move, didn't flinch, just observed. It was unnerving. Jace flexed his fingers, trying to keep the blood flowing. So, what now? His voice was hoarse, stiff like his frozen muscles. Zithrak tilted his head slightly. You live. For now. Jace let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. For now. That's reassuring. The warrior's lips curled slightly, a ghost of a smirk or perhaps just the way his species showed indifference. You are weak. The cold has already taken much from you. But you are not broken. Jace frowned. And that matters to you? Zithrak didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood, towering over Jace with an effortless grace that betrayed his sheer strength. His armor shifted slightly, the biometal plates adjusting as he moved. I do not suffer burdens, Zithrak finally said. If you are to stay, you must prove your worth. Jace tensed. He'd seen these kinds of situations before, prison camps, survival colonies, even war zones where only the strong or useful were allowed to live. He wasn't about to become some alien's entertainment or pet. His mind raced through options. His gun was lost in the wreck, his supplies scattered. If it came to a fight, he wouldn't stand a chance against Zithrak's sheer size and power. But that didn't mean he was helpless. I don't need charity, Jace muttered. Zithrak let out a low, rumbling sound. Charity? No. A test. The warrior bent down and reached into the snow beside him, pulling out a jagged, crystalline shard of ice. He tossed it into the fire, watching as it hissed and melted instantly. This world kills without hesitation, Zithrak said. Survival is not given, it is taken. Jace clenched his jaw. He had fought for survival before, on hostile planets, in war-torn colonies, even in the depths of space where one wrong move could mean death. He wasn't about to roll over and beg for shelter like some lost scavenger. He needed to shift the balance. Jace met the warrior's unblinking stare. Fine. What's the test? Zithrak's expression didn't change, but Jace could feel the shift in the air. The challenge had been accepted. The storm grows, Zithrak said, looking toward the swirling darkness beyond their small sanctuary. Something moves within it. Jace followed his gaze, squinting against the howling winds. At first, all he could see was endless white. But then, movement. A flicker of shadow, barely visible, but unmistakable. Something was out there. What is it? Jace asked. Zithrak's grip tightened on the hilt of the blade at his hip. A predator. Jace felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. And you want me to fight it? No, Zithrak said, stepping forward. I want to see if you can survive it. Jace stared at him, waiting for more clarification, but none came. The alien warrior simply turned and walked toward the storm, expecting Jace to follow. He hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to stay by the fire, to hold on to what little warmth he had left. But he had made his choice. Survive the cold, or stay close. With a deep breath, Jace pushed himself to his feet and followed Zithrak into the storm. The wind was merciless, cutting through his tattered survival suit like knives. Snow whipped at his face, blinding him, reducing his world to a swirling chaos of white and shadow. Zithrak moved like he had lived here all his life, unbothered, steady, his massive form barely affected by the elements. Jace, on the other hand, struggled. His boots sank into the ice with every step, his breath came in ragged gasps, and every muscle in his body screamed for rest. They walked for what felt like hours, but Jace knew it couldn't have been more than minutes. Then Zithrak stopped. Jace followed his gaze. At first, he saw nothing. Then, movement. A figure loomed in the blizzard, its outline shifting, grotesque. It was unlike anything Jace had seen before. It wasn't just an animal. It was something made for this environment. Thick, spiked fur, elongated limbs with claws that could tear through steel, and eyes that burned with an unnatural light. The predator had found them. Jace's heart pounded. He reached for the knife strapped to his belt, a poor weapon against a beast of that size, but better than nothing. Zithrak, however, did not draw his weapon. Instead, he stepped forward, raising his hand. The predator let out a guttural snarl, its breath visible in the freezing air. It circled them slowly, its body low to the ground, muscles tensed. Jace tightened his grip on the knife, waiting for the inevitable attack. But Zithrak remained still. Then, in a slow, deliberate motion, he pressed his fist to his chest and exhaled a low, resonant sound, almost like a growl. The predator stopped. Jace watched in disbelief as the creature hesitated, its glowing eyes locking onto Zithrak's. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the beast turned and vanished into the storm. Jace's breath came in sharp gasps. What the hell was that? Zithrak exhaled, his expression unreadable. It knows me. Jace swallowed hard, still gripping his knife. And what if it didn't? Zithrak finally turned to him, silver eyes gleaming in the darkness. Then you would already be dead. Jace exhaled, shaking his head. He had survived, but just barely. The warrior studied him for a moment, then nodded. You are not useless. Jace almost laughed at the absurdity of it. That's your way of saying I passed? Zithrak didn't answer. Instead, he simply turned and began walking back toward the fire. Jace hesitated for only a second before following. As the storm howled around them, he knew one thing for certain, this was only the beginning. And if he wanted to survive, he would have to learn the warrior's ways. The warrior's code. The journey back to the fire felt longer than before, though Jace knew it was the same distance. Every step was heavier, every breath colder, but what weighed on him most was the realization that he had no control over this situation. Zithrak had saved his life, twice now. But why? As they reached the fire, the flames were lower than before, barely holding back the cold. Jace dropped onto the frozen ground, exhaustion sinking into his bones. Zithrak, however, remained standing, watching the storm with an unreadable expression. Jace wiped frost from his face. That thing out there, what was it? Zithrak didn't answer immediately. He reached into his pack, pulling out a small metal sphere. With a flick of his fingers, the device expanded into a semicircle, glowing faintly. A holographic map hovered above it, flickering from interference. Jace leaned forward. Is that a map of this planet? Zithrak nodded. Incomplete. Jace's brows furrowed. You don't know your own world? Zithrak's silver eyes flashed toward him, sharp as a blade. This is not my world. Something in his tone made Jace hesitate. Zithrak hadn't just claimed this planet as his domain, he was stuck here, just like Jace. How long have you been here? Jace asked carefully. Zithrak's jaw tightened. Long enough. Jace exhaled, watching the flames flicker. He had been so focused on his own survival that he hadn't stopped to consider what Zithrak's story might be. If the warrior had been stranded here, did that mean others were, too? Are there more of you? Jace asked. Zithrak's gaze darkened. No. Something in his voice hinted at loss. Not just solitude, but something deeper, grief, perhaps. Jace knew better than to press. Instead, he turned his focus to the map. So, if this place isn't your home, why are you mapping it? Zithrak turned the device slightly, shifting the hologram. Because knowing is surviving. Jace nodded slowly. It made sense. If they wanted to get off this frozen wasteland, they needed to know what they were dealing with. But the real question was, did Zithrak even want to leave? Before Jace could ask, Zithrak stood and stretched, his massive frame casting a long shadow against the ice. Rest. We move at dawn. Jace frowned. Move where? The warrior turned slightly, his expression unreadable. To the next trial. Jace tensed. What trial? Zithrak let out a low, amused sound. You wish to survive? Then you must learn. Jace exhaled sharply. So, what? You're my teacher now. Zithrak stepped closer, his towering form radiating raw strength. If you were weak, you would be dead already. You are not weak. But you are untrained. Jace narrowed his eyes. And what do I get out of this? Zithrak tilted his head slightly. Life. Jace sighed. The alien had a point. He was barely clinging to survival as it was. If he wanted a chance at escaping this frozen hell, he needed every advantage he could get. He leaned back against the icy ground, letting exhaustion take over. He didn't trust Zithrak, not yet. But for now, trust wasn't necessary. Survival was. The morning of the hunt. Jace woke to the sound of ice cracking. His eyes shot open, heart pounding. For a brief second, he forgot where he was. Then the cold reminded him. Zithrak was already up, crouching near the fire. His armor had shifted slightly, adapting to the frigid temperatures. In one hand, he held a blade, long, curved, and deadly sharp. He was carving something from bone. Jace sat up slowly. You sleep? Zithrak didn't look up. Not like you. Jace rolled his shoulders, wincing as the soreness from the previous night settled in. Great. Another advantage you have over me. Zithrak didn't respond. Instead, he held up the carved object, a crude but effective-looking spear. He tossed it to Jace. Jace caught it awkwardly. And this is for. Zithrak stood, towering over him. Hunting. Jace frowned. Hunting? For what? Zithrak gestured toward the ice-covered valley below. Food. Jace's stomach clenched. He hadn't realized how hungry he was. He had been running on pure adrenaline, but now the gnawing emptiness in his gut was impossible to ignore. Zithrak turned and began walking. Keep up. Jace muttered under his breath and followed. The hunt begins. The valley stretched wide before them, a frozen expanse of jagged cliffs and deep crevices. Snow swirled around them, but the sky had cleared just enough to let in the pale light of a distant sun. Zithrak moved with purpose, his massive frame navigating the terrain effortlessly. Jace, on the other hand, struggled. His boots slipped on the ice, and his breath formed heavy clouds in the frigid air. After nearly an hour of trekking, Zithrak raised a hand. Jace froze. Zithrak pointed. At first, Jace saw nothing. Then, movement. A creature, low to the ground, its thick fur blending into the ice. It had powerful limbs, adapted for the cold, and eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light. A perfect predator. Zithrak lowered his voice. You kill, or you starve. Jace gripped the spear tightly. He had fought before, pirates, mercenaries, even soldiers, but this was different. This wasn't war. This was survival. He exhaled, steadying himself. The creature moved, sniffing the air. Jace adjusted his grip. He had one shot. Zithrak watched, silent. Jace took a slow step forward. The wind shifted, carrying his scent toward the beast. Its ears twitched. It knew he was there. Then, it bolted. Jace reacted without thinking. He threw the spear with all his strength. The weapon sailed through the air, fast, precise. A sharp thud. The creature staggered, letting out a shrill cry before collapsing onto the ice. Jace's heart pounded. He had done it. Zithrak approached the fallen beast, inspecting the wound. Then, to Jace's surprise, the warrior let out a low, approving sound. You learn. Jace exhaled sharply, wiping sweat from his brow. Yeah, well. I had a good teacher. Zithrak's silver eyes met his. Not yet. Jace frowned. What do you mean, not yet? Zithrak stood, gripping the dead creature's body. You hunted. Now, you must endure. Jace's stomach twisted. Endure what? Zithrak's expression was unreadable as he started walking back toward camp. The long night. Jace swallowed hard. He didn't know what that meant. But something told him it was nothing good. The long night. Jace Carter had never been afraid of the dark. He had drifted through the empty void of space, the deepest abyss known to mankind. He had fought in the shadows of war, where death lurked behind every flickering light. But here, on this frozen world, the darkness was different. It was alive. Zithrak had not spoken much since the hunt. The warrior carried their prize, a heavy, furred creature draped over his broad shoulder, without so much as a grunt of effort. Jace, on the other hand, was drained. The spear throw had taken what little strength he had left. His stomach twisted in hunger, but he knew better than to ask when they would eat. The wind had picked up again, howling through the jagged cliffs. The storm was returning. And Zithrak's warning echoed in Jace's mind. The long night. As they reached the fire, Jace collapsed onto the ground, sucking in deep breaths. He wanted to rest, but Zithrak was already moving, carving into the carcass with swift, practiced movements. Steam rose as he worked, the fresh kill still warm despite the freezing air. Jace wiped the frost from his brow. So, you gonna tell me what this long night thing is? Zithrak didn't look up. You will know soon enough. Jace groaned. Fantastic. More cryptic alien wisdom. The warrior merely continued his work. Soon, slabs of meat sizzled over the fire, the fat dripping and crackling in the flames. Jace's mouth watered. The scent alone was enough to make his stomach clench painfully. Zithrak finally tore off a portion of the cooked meat and tossed it to Jace. He didn't hesitate. He bit into it greedily, barely noticing the unfamiliar taste. It was rough, gamey, and slightly bitter, but it was food. And food meant survival. Zithrak watched him eat, his silver eyes gleaming. Hunger makes you fast. Desperation makes you strong. But strength alone is not survival. Jace chewed slowly, narrowing his eyes. And what is survival? Zithrak leaned forward, the firelight casting sharp shadows across his face. Endurance. Jace exhaled. Yeah. Well, I've endured plenty. Zithrak's lips curled slightly. Not yet. Before Jace could argue, a deep, resonant sound rolled through the frozen valley. It was distant, yet heavy, like the growl of some ancient beast echoing through the mountains. Jace stiffened. What the hell was that? Zithrak's gaze flickered toward the storm. His grip tightened around his blade. The night begins. Jace swallowed hard. And that means... Zithrak stood, towering over him. It means we do not sleep. The things that hunt in darkness. Jace pressed his back against the rock, spear in hand, heart pounding in his chest. The fire crackled weakly, but its glow barely touched the shadows beyond their small sanctuary. Then he saw them. Shapes. Moving in the blizzard. They were fast, too fast. Just vague, shifting forms in the snow, circling, waiting. He could hear their claws scraping against the ice, their low hissing breaths carried by the wind. Predators? Jace whispered. Zithrak's grip tightened on his weapon. Not like before. Jace swallowed hard. He had barely survived hunting a single beast. But this was something else. The creatures in the darkness were watching. Studying. Waiting. Zithrak exhaled slowly. They do not kill for hunger. They kill for the kill. Jace cursed under his breath. Great. Murderous ice demons. Just my luck. Zithrak stepped forward, raising his weapon. The fire cast flickering shadows across his massive form, and for a moment, he looked as monstrous as the things that hunted them. One of the creatures lunged. Jace barely had time to react. He caught only a glimpse, razor-sharp limbs, glowing eyes, jaws filled with needle-like teeth, before Zithrak moved. The warrior spun with brutal precision. His blade flashed in the firelight, slicing through the beast in a single, fluid motion. The creature let out a shriek as dark blood splattered onto the ice. Jace barely had time to breathe before another one came from the side. He reacted on instinct. He drove his spear forward, catching the beast in the shoulder. It screamed, twisting violently, nearly wrenching the weapon from his grip. Then Zithrak was there. The warrior grabbed the creature by the throat and slammed it into the ground with enough force to crack the ice beneath it. The beast let out a gurgling hiss before falling still. Jace panted, pulling his spear free. Tell me that's all of them. Zithrak didn't answer. Jace followed his gaze. The shadows moved again. And this time, there were more. The battle for fire. The attack came fast. Jace barely had time to brace himself before the creatures surged forward. He drove his spear into the first one, but another slammed into his side, knocking the wind from his lungs. Zithrak was a whirlwind of destruction. His blade danced through the air, cutting down anything that came too close. But for every beast he killed, two more seemed to take its place. Jace struggled to his feet, swinging wildly. His spear connected, sending another creature sprawling, but his arms were shaking. He couldn't keep this up. The fire dimmed. Jace's breath caught. The creatures weren't just attacking, they were driving them away from the fire. Zithrak snarled. He knew it too. The fire is our ground, the warrior growled. We do not retreat. Jace gritted his teeth. Then we make our stand. The battle blurred into chaos. Claws and steel, screams and snarls, the sharp sting of frost biting at his skin. Jace lost track of how many he had killed, how many times he had barely dodged death. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The last creature fell, its lifeless body collapsing onto the ice. Jace stood panting, his arms burning, his legs shaking. His spear was slick with dark blood. Zithrak stood beside him, his breathing steady despite the carnage. The storm began to settle. The wind carried away the last echoes of the battle, leaving only silence. Jace exhaled. That was the long night? Zithrak wiped his blade clean. The first of many. Jace let out a humorless laugh. Great. Can't wait for the sequel. Zithrak actually smirked. You fought well. Jace glanced at him, surprised. It was the first genuine praise he had received from the warrior. He looked down at his shaking hands. I survived. But he knew survival wasn't enough. If he wanted to get off this planet, if he wanted to make it out alive, he needed more than just luck. He needed to be stronger. And for that, he needed to learn. Jace took a deep breath and met Zithrak's gaze. Teach me. The warrior's silver eyes gleamed in the firelight. Then the real trials begin. The trials of strength. The bodies of the fallen creatures lay scattered around the fire, their black blood seeping into the ice. The long night had passed, but Jace Carter knew this was only the beginning. He had fought before. He had killed before. But never like this. Never in a battle where the enemy wasn't just flesh and claws, but the very world itself. He exhaled sharply, his breath curling in the freezing air. His muscles ached, his fingers numb, but he was alive. That was all that mattered. Zithrak stood across from him, his expression unreadable as always. The warrior cleaned his blade with slow, deliberate movements, his silver eyes gleaming in the firelight. There was no exhaustion in his stance, no sign that the battle had taken anything from him. Jace envied that. The alien warrior glanced at him. You are still weak. Jace let out a tired laugh. Yeah, thanks for that. Real confidence booster. Zithrak sheathed his blade. Your body moves, but it does not endure. Jace frowned. I just survived a horde of those things. I think I did fine. Zithrak stepped closer. Fine is not enough. Fine will get you killed. Jace clenched his jaw. He hated it, but Zithrak was right. His hands were still shaking from the fight. His vision was still blurry with exhaustion. If another attack had come, he wouldn't have made it. The warrior studied him for a moment longer before turning toward the rising sun. The storm had finally passed, revealing the endless expanse of frozen wasteland stretching before them. Jagged cliffs. Ice-covered plains. And, somewhere in the distance, something far worse than the creatures they had just faced. Zithrak gestured toward the horizon. We move. Jace groaned, rubbing his sore arms. Move where? Zithrak didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pulled a small device from his belt, a smooth, metallic sphere that hummed softly in his grip. He pressed a button, and a faint, glowing map projected into the air. Jace stepped closer, studying the layout. It wasn't detailed, just a rough grid of the land. But there was a single, glowing marker far to the north. What's that? Jace asked, pointing at the marker. Zithrak's expression darkened. Shelter. Or death. Jace frowned. That's not an answer. Zithrak closed the map and began walking. You will understand when we arrive. Jace sighed and followed, his legs protesting with every step. The ice cliffs. The landscape shifted as they walked. What had once been open plains of frozen tundra became a treacherous maze of towering cliffs and deep chasms. The wind howled through the narrow pathways, sending loose ice tumbling into the abyss below. Jace tightened his grip on the spear Zithrak had given him, using it for balance as they navigated the unstable terrain. After nearly an hour of walking, the warrior finally stopped. He turned to Jace, his silver eyes unreadable. This is your next trial. Jace frowned. My what? Zithrak gestured toward the cliff face beside them. It was a sheer wall of jagged ice, rising at least 50 feet into the sky. The surface was uneven, filled with cracks and protrusions, but climbable. Jace's stomach twisted. You've got to be kidding me. Zithrak crossed his arms. You wish to survive? Then climb. Jace stared at him. There's no way up there. Not without equipment. Zithrak stepped forward. You are human. You adapt. Jace shook his head. Adapt? That's not adaptation, that's suicide. The warrior tilted his head slightly. Then die here. Jace cursed under his breath. He knew what this was. A test. Another one. Zithrak wanted to see what he was made of, to see if he could push beyond his limits. He hated that it was working. Jace took a deep breath and studied the wall. He had climbed before, but never without gear. One wrong move, one slip, and he was dead. But there was no other option. Without another word, Jace reached for the first handhold and began to climb. The trial of the climb. The ice was rough beneath his fingers, jagged and sharp. Jace gritted his teeth as he pulled himself upward, his breath coming in short gasps. His arms burned with the effort, his fingers numb from the cold. Zithrak watched from below, unmoving. Jace focused on his breathing. One step at a time. One handhold at a time. The wind howled around him, threatening to knock him off balance. His grip slipped once, just for a second, but his instincts kicked in, and he caught himself before he fell. Higher. Keep going. His muscles screamed in protest, but he refused to stop. Minutes passed like hours. Sweat dripped down his face despite the cold. His breath was ragged, his vision blurring from exhaustion. But he didn't let go. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he reached the top. Jace pulled himself over the edge, rolling onto his back, gasping for air. His heart pounded in his chest, his body shaking from exhaustion. Zithrak climbed up beside him effortlessly, barely breaking a sweat. He looked down at Jace with a hint of amusement. You live. Jace let out a weak laugh. Barely. Zithrak extended a hand. Jace hesitated for only a moment before taking it. The warrior pulled him to his feet. Jace exhaled sharply. He had done it. He had climbed the impossible. And yet, Zithrak's expression remained unreadable. Jace narrowed his eyes. What now? Zithrak turned toward the horizon. Now, you learn why we climb. Jace followed his gaze. And what he saw made his blood run cold. Far in the distance, beyond the cliffs, was a structure. Massive. Ancient. It was buried in ice, its jagged spires piercing the sky like the bones of a long-dead god. A ruin. Jace swallowed hard. Something was waiting for them there. Something far worse than the long night. The ruins beneath the ice. The climb had taken everything from Jace Carter, his strength, his breath, his sense of control, but standing at the top of the ice cliffs, staring at the ancient ruins ahead, he realized that the real trial had just begun. The structure loomed in the distance, half buried beneath the ice, its massive spires piercing the frozen sky like jagged teeth. It was old. Older than anything Jace had ever seen. Time had tried to erase it, but something about the way the ice clung to it, almost unwillingly, told him that whatever lay beneath wasn't meant to be forgotten. Zithrak stood beside him, silent. The warrior's silver eyes reflected the ruins, his expression unreadable. Jace exhaled, still catching his breath. That's where we're going, isn't it? Zithrak didn't answer immediately. Then, in a voice lower than before, he said, that is where you must go. Jace turned to him. What? Zithrak finally looked at him. You wish to survive? Then you must know what hunts you. Jace frowned. Hunts me? You mean those things from last night? Zithrak shook his head. No. The true predators. A cold weight settled in Jace's gut. The creatures from the long night had been terrifying enough. But Zithrak was telling him that something worse was out there. Something that lived inside those ruins. Jace clenched his fists. And you're not coming with me? Zithrak's gaze darkened. This is your trial. Jace let out a bitter laugh. Of course it is. The warrior turned and began walking. We move. Jace cursed under his breath and followed. A descent into darkness. The approach to the ruins was treacherous. The ice beneath their feet cracked with every step, threatening to swallow them whole. The wind had died down, leaving only an eerie silence. Jace hated it. He had spent years in space, drifting through the void where silence was a constant companion. But this was different. This was a silence that watched. That waited. They reached the entrance of the ruins, a massive, jagged archway carved into the ice-covered stone. It was taller than any structure Jace had ever seen, its surface covered in strange, ancient symbols. Jace ran a gloved hand over one of the markings. The stone was cold, unnaturally so. This place, he muttered. What was it? Zithrak stood at the threshold, his eyes scanning the darkness within. A tomb. Jace felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. A tomb for what? The warrior didn't answer. Jace sighed. Yeah. Thought so. Zithrak finally turned to him. You go alone from here. Jace's breath caught. Are you serious? Zithrak nodded. You must see what waits inside. Jace swallowed hard, staring into the black abyss beyond the entrance. He had faced death before. Pirates. War. The long night. But something about this felt different. He turned back to Zithrak. If I don't come back? Zithrak met his gaze. Then you were never meant to. Jace exhaled sharply. Great. Real comforting. The warrior stepped back, waiting. Watching. Jace took a deep breath. Then, gripping his spear tightly, he stepped into the ruins. The ghosts of the past. The moment Jace crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped. The ice here was different. It wasn't just frozen water, it was something unnatural, something alive in its stillness. The walls pulsed faintly, as if breathing. Jace swallowed hard and pressed forward. The deeper he went, the more the ruins revealed themselves. The walls weren't just carved, they were grown, as if the stone itself had been shaped by something alien. Strange metallic veins ran through the floor, pulsing faintly with a light that flickered between blue and green. Jace's heart pounded. This wasn't just some ancient ruin. This was a machine. A machine that was still alive. Jace tightened his grip on his spear. He had seen his fair share of abandoned tech in his time, war machines, lost ships, even entire cities swallowed by time. But this? This place didn't feel abandoned. It felt like it was waiting. Then he heard it. A whisper. Jace spun around, scanning the darkness. Nothing. But the whispering continued. Faint. Lingering at the edges of his hearing, like voices carried on the wind. He took a slow step forward. The sound grew louder. Not one voice. Many. Jace clenched his jaw. He didn't believe in ghosts. But this place did. The whispers grew into something worse. Not words, but memories. Images flickered in his mind, shadows moving, figures screaming, something rising from the ice. Jace stumbled back, his breath quickening. Something had happened here. Something terrible. And then, the shadows moved. Jace's pulse skyrocketed as a figure stepped forward from the darkness. Not a beast. Not one of the predators from the long night. Something else. It was humanoid. Tall, thin, its body encased in metallic armor that pulsed with the same strange energy as the walls. But its face. Its face was wrong. It had no eyes. Just a smooth, featureless surface where a face should have been. And yet, Jace knew, it was looking at him. The whispers stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than anything Jace had ever felt. Then, the figure moved. Fast. Jace barely had time to react before it was on him. He raised his spear just in time, the weapon clashing against something invisible, like a force field surrounding the creature. The impact sent him flying backward, slamming into the icy wall. Pain exploded through his body. The figure stepped closer, its head tilting slightly. It didn't attack again. It studied him. Jace gritted his teeth, forcing himself to his feet. Yeah? You wanna stare, or are we actually gonna do this? The figure didn't respond. Then, without warning, it vanished. Jace's breath caught. He spun around, searching the shadows. Nothing. Just the whispering, creeping back in. Then, from the darkness, a voice spoke. Not in any language Jace knew. Not in any language that should exist. But somehow, he understood. Not ready. Jace's blood ran cold. Then, just as quickly as it had come, the presence was gone. Jace stood frozen in place, his breath coming in ragged gasps. What the hell was that? He turned and ran. The warrior's judgment. Jace stumbled out of the ruins, panting. His body was trembling, not from the cold, but from whatever had just happened. Zithrak was waiting. He looked at Jace, then at the ruins behind him. You saw. Jace swallowed hard. What the hell is in there? Zithrak exhaled slowly. The past. And the future. Jace shuddered. It spoke to me. Zithrak's eyes darkened. Then it knows you. Jace looked back at the ruins. The whispering was gone, but he could still feel it, lingering beneath his skin. Whatever was inside, it wasn't finished with him. And somehow, Jace knew, neither was Zithrak.